Here we are, Tyrion 4 of A Storm of Swords.
Mhm.
Tyrion visits Simon Silvertongue, pay him to leave King's Landing, but the singer wishes to join the tournament of singers that will take place during Joffrey's wedding. He blackmails Tyrion by indicating that he will tell him about his relationship with Shay. Tyrion promises him that one of the other singers will be removed and Bronn will visit him in 3 days' time. Outside, Tyrion orders Bronn to kill Simon. Later, Tyrion's father shows him the 2 new Valyrian swords that he had made for Joffrey and Jaime. Master Topo Mott reworked the metal, and the color of the blade on each sword is black and red. House Lannister has not had a Valyrian sword in hundreds of years, and try as he might, Tywin could never get any of the lesser houses to sell theirs. Where the steel from these new swords came from is not revealed. Of course, we know where it's from. Tywin tells him that he must consummate his marriage to Sansa and that Mace Tyrell rejected the marriage proposal between Cersei and Willis, probably because the Queen of Thorns told him to. Pycelle brings dire tidings from the Wall and that Maester Aemon fears Lord Mormont is dead. Tywin tells Pycelle to send a veiled message that no men shall be sent to the Wall unless Jaina Slynt is considered for the post of Lord Commander of the Night's Watch. Tyrion thinks to himself that he should have had Slynt and Pycelle put to death when he had the chance. So
A lot of stuff here.
a lot of cool stuff, a lot of theories we're going to dive into. And, actually, one of the things I was thinking about, and I was thinking this is actually one of the better things about, especially earlier seasons of Game of Thrones of the show, is that we do actually get some conversations in the show between Tywin and the Queen of Thorns, right? Lady Olenna Tyrell. And they do actually have a sit down conversation. And it's like, now we're just hearing about in the books, hey, they had a conversation and this is what they decided. And that's like one of those things I do like about, especially like the earlier seasons of Game of Thrones, like that conversation that's, there's scenes that are definitely not in the book anywhere. And like season 1 is so close to the show, but there are some pretty cool conversations that feel like they could have taken place in Game of Thrones. I mean, once you get to the later stuff, it's like now we're missing a lot of stuff, so it's hard to tell how close we are. But at least here, you can be like, oh, maybe that conversation that they included in the show, like, headcanon wise, you can kind of piece it here because it doesn't really change a lot of things. Like the conversation that Robert has with Cersei, the conversation that Jaime has with Ned, right, with about, oh, is that what you tell yourself at night? Like some of those things you can kind of piece into your head canon if you want. And like they do have a conversation where they are, discussing terms before the wedding.
Yeah, it's interesting that Gurm is able to accomplish so much through certain POVs, and like it's always interesting on who he selects in the books to see these things and to hear about them. And for instance, Tyrion being around and hearing about the Wall, and we know that Tyrion obviously has a relationship with the Wall from the beginning of the series. He also has a lot of feelings about the Tyrells. He talks about the Tyrells long before he ends up having a conversation with his dad in this chapter, and he's talking about how the Tyrells are bringing things in. Inflation is very high since Blackwater. And one thing the summary doesn't really mention, but I think is pretty key, is the fact that Tyrion is walking through the Mudgate, where he has obviously had many memories now from Blackwater, and we're seeing the kind of the aftermath of Blackwater as Tyrion walks through. And things seem pretty testy around the small folk.
Yeah. Let me just get this opening line here because I think it's a really strong paragraph. Nothing remained beyond the King's Gate but mud and ashes and bits of burned bone. Yet already there were people living in the shadow of the city walls and others selling fish from barrows and barrels. Tyrion felt their eyes on him as he rode past, chilly eyes, angry and unsympathetic. No one dared speak to him or try to bar his way, not with Bronn beside him in his oiled black mail. If I were alone, though, they would pull me down and smash my face with a cobblestone, as they did for Preston Greenfield.
Yeah.
They'd come back quicker than the rats, he complained. We burned them out once, and you think they'd take a lesson.
Yeah, so this is really interesting because a little bit later in the chapter, so what this is doing is setting the tone of the small folk in many ways, but also later in the chapter, we hear about the great, we hear about the Septon, the high Septon, and basically that he's a bot man, he'll do whatever. And we know that that's not going to be the case. And then whenever that shift ends up happening, and then the small folk being in the manner in which they are, you see how much the High Sparrow has influence in King's Landing. And a lot of that is set up in this chapter. which is incredible because that doesn't happen for a whole nother book.
Mhm.
So George was definitely laying some brickwork here, making sure that we saw the attitude of the people of King's Landing and Flea Bottom and near the Mud Gate and merchants and inflation and just the state of things. And also how absolutely clueless Tywin is to the common people. And he just wants to keep spending and spending and spending because that's what Lannisters do.
Mhm. Yeah. And, then eventually we start to hear about how much money is actually there. But yeah, there's a ton of stuff in here. And, even this character that Tyrion is going to go visit, right? Simon Silvertongue.
Oh, man.
Tyrion thinks of him time and time again throughout the series, right? I
Mhm.
mean, he thinks of him in Dance of the Dragons. He confesses to Penny that he had him killed for writing a song about him. Then Tyrion remembers a pot shop in King's Landing that made the best bowl of brown when, the second sons, this is Kem, and Kem is a character. When he asked Tyrion whether he ate a bowl of brown, Tyrion answers that he did once or twice, and he calls it singer's stew.
Yeah, because we hear Bronn saying, "Oh, they use all kinds of meat down there," and he's like, "Remind me never to eat there." And this is so it's very interesting. We also have to, kind of preface this with the fact that the chapter before this, it's been many months, but it was Jaime 4, and Jaime has lost his hand, which is ironic because we're in a Tyrion chapter watching him walk around after he's lost the position of hand. So we have a kind of a meta version of hand and then a real hand being missing. And Tyrion, whereas Jaime becomes a little bit humbled and begins this almost redemption arc at this point, we see Tyrion kind of descending into some pretty awful things. We were happy when he sent Janos Slynt to the wall, but now we have a singer who's written a song that makes Tyrion feel threatened. And instead of handling it any other way, he actually goes straight to violence and he's going to have Bronn kill him. A bit of a turn for Tyrion's character, and it maybe shows us a different side of him as he's on the downside right now. He's not in favor in King's Landing. So, him losing the title of hand and then Jaime losing his physical hand, I think is a kind of a comparison that we can make here.
Yeah. Yeah, and so Tyrion immediately also starts thinking about, I mean, he immediately he starts going into the he starts going into like how this is how much it's going to cost to rebuild and everything. But real
Mhm.
quick, I just want to back up actually to that Jaime chapter because it's kind of interesting. And this is one of those things where we talk about like the connection of like the end of a previous chapter and the beginning of a new chapter, because in A Song of Ice and Fire, as we go point of view, it feels like often like look at the map, right? And you're like, okay, now we're with John in the Wall, just like the show did, right? Where it's like, okay, and now you shift all the way down here to King's Landing, and then you shift all the way over to here to Essos. But if you
Mhm.
go back to that Jaime chapter, as Qyburn is getting him prepared, they're talking a little bit about like what happened with Tyrion, right? And so Qyburn is saying, this is the chapter before, tell me about of the battle. He's asking about the battle that, with Tyrion and everything. And he said, Lord Stannis was caught between your father and the fire. It is said the imp set the river of itself aflame. Jaime saw green flames reaching up to the sky higher than the tallest towers as burning men screamed in the streets. I've dreamed this dream before. It was almost funny, but there was no one to share the joke, which Tyrion, we think of Tyrion, he is like a jokester and all this stuff. We immediately go to the Tyrion chapter in which Tyrion is now riding through the Mudgate and looking at bits of burned bone and ash and all of these
Mhm.
things and looking at the aftermath of this whole war. It's just something that George does in his writing that is just so great because he is able to accomplish like 16 things with one line. And it's why Winds of Winter is probably taking as long. And we've said this for years, is because, okay, like in just reading that little thing of Jaime, okay, it's you in one hand, you could say, okay, that's Jaime dreaming about the king burning everything,
Mhm.
right? Because that's his whole deal,
Right.
right? Or it could have to do with Cersei potentially blowing up the Sept of Baelor in the future,
It
or it could
could.
do with the battle with the White Walkers in the future. Or why is Jaime dreaming this dream? Has he, was he dreaming it because he's just had a dream about it, like even before? So is it
Mhm.
prophetic, or is it like PTSD from what could have happened, or is it tied to what Tyrion and this battle as well? So it's just so interesting that you're able to do that while tying it into the next chapter
Yeah.
and like setting in a way, because it's only like if you just look at it's like one paragraph before essentially this chapter begins, And so you're also able to tie it in immediately if you're just reading page by page to this beginning chapter here where Tyrion is now seeing the aftermath of this war. And so it's so interesting that he's able to do
It's
that.
Tyrion walking through a battlefield, right? Not Jaime the warrior, which is so interesting because early in A Song of Ice and Fire, Jaime is off making victories before he gets taken captive, and Tyrion is captured, right? That's kind of what kicks it all off, but they end up flipping by the end of Clash of Kings, and Jaime is now captured, and Tyrion is in the battles.
Mhm.
How interesting is that? And then
Yeah.
here, we're getting perception. Perception is huge in Song of Ice and Fire of the folk, and Tyrion's obviously not considered to be much of a mighty warrior, but we know the truth. We know that the Hound ran. We know that Joffrey backed off. We know that Tyrion was the brave one. And it makes you, I always think about Jaime at what he thinks of Tyrion. Like, does he think Tyrion would even be capable of that? Like, does he know deep down that Tyrion's capable of that? I'm not sure. But Jaime has a lot of dreams in this series. And some of them I think are end game things. I think he sees some White Walker battles at some point. I can't remember if it's this book or if it's in A Feast for Crows. It's one of them. And I'm sure we'll get to it at some point, but it is definitely a thing to pay attention to, the way that George sequences these chapters and the way he ends chapters and the way he opens up chapters. There's also something a little bit further on. I'm just going to jump a little bit ahead.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm only going to do this because I think it's appropriate to mention it now, but we hear a little bit about this song, and one of the lines that is repeated is, "For hands of gold are always cold, but a woman's hands are warm." And I think it's interesting that the hand of gold that we're going to see here in a few chapters is going to be Jaime's hand, which is cold because it's not real. And the woman's hands that are warm in this regard, I think, would be Brienne. So it's kind of a two-purpose line in many ways, because clearly we're talking about hands of gold. Tyrion have hands of gold because he's rich, and then the hands of Shay that are warm, and that's all he really desires. But also, it kind of works with Jaime. So Tyrion and Jaime's mirroring is
great.
It's great, and it's all throughout the series. It's very much an echo that we constantly hear as we read.
Yeah, and even if you go back, Jaime says when he in that, and just again, this is just a couple paragraphs before. If you're thinking about it as like one page to the next, even though it's they're separated by chapters, is Jaime saying it was almost funny, but there was no one to share the joke. Well, who would Jaime joke with? Tyrion. Then immediately we jump into a Tyrion chapter. Now, as Tyrion is walking around in this opening, it's like the third paragraph, he says, "I've seen enough for now. We'll return on the morrow with the guild masters to go over their plans." He sighed. "Well, I burned most of this. I suppose it's only just that I rebuild it." And in a way, Jaime is getting his hand burned like a second ago, because cauterizing the wound and dealing with the wound. In a way, you could make an argument that Tyrion is the one who causes Jaime to get his hand cut. 'Cause, it's the thing that kicks off. Obviously, you could go back and say it's Bran or whatever, but it is Tyrion getting captured.
Yeah.
By Catelyn that kicks the whole kind of. That's the real
talk about a butterfly
kicks
effect.
everything off. Yeah,
right.
That's the whole thing. Is Tyrion's the one who gets captured, and Tyrion could have just went to King's Landing with everyone, but he's like, "Well, I want to go see the Wall." So he goes with Jon Snow. If he doesn't do that, and Tyrion just goes to King's Landing with everyone else as they return, so many things would not have happened.
Always being inquisitive, and it's interesting what we always ask. Tyrion likes to read and all these things, and we talk about how he has to sharpen his mind like his sword. But one of the biggest influences on this was actually, and I'm not sure how to pronounce this name, I always mess it up, but it's Tyrion Lannister, which was Tywin's youngest brother, who ends up going to try to retrieve Bright Roar, the Valyrian steel sword, and then is never seen ever again. And if we remember, he's actually the one who gave Tyrion, I believe, his first book, which was really, really important. It's Wonders and Wonders Made by Man by Lammas Longstrider, and often had Tyrion recite the 16 wonders of the world. Geryon or Geryon, however you want to say it, also taught Tyrion some tumbling tricks when he was 6 or 7 and would praise his skills. So the obvious canon that we got dropped on us in the first book, that Tyrion could do this tumbling trip off the gate.
I think George wishes he had never done.
Oh, without a doubt. I think that there's a chance that his uncle was going to play a bigger role in the story, and the story simply outgrew that, because the whole idea of him going on a mission for this lost sword and then disappearing and him being so influential on Tyrion is kind of an interesting storyline. I don't think we'll ever see him again. I think he's dead, but it's just interesting that Tyrion's inquisitive nature, we're kind of reminded of it constantly, but here we actually get mention of who inspired him, and it's someone that he thinks about quite a bit. So very cool stuff.
Yeah, and some people think that Tyrion, this, ultimately Tyrion, where he's at, in A Dance with Dragons, is a lot of people think Tyrion's going to run into. I mean, those are sort of the big Tyrion theories right now, as well as like just House Lannister theories. Is that Tyrion over in Essos, where we finish with Dance with Dragons, is going to run in all kinds of people, and people think Geryon or I think it's. I don't know how you want to pronounce it. Lannister is somebody Tyrion could run into or see his ship. Or Tyrion might find Bright Roar, right? There's also Tysha he might run into, his old wife, and he's with Jorah Mormont, and Jorah might run into his ex-wife, who might be over there. And
they might do a wife swap episode.
Who knows, man? I mean, that's what it's all coming down to. But that is certainly something. So yeah, I mean, this is one of these chapters. This chapter actually drops kind of a lot of like sort of deep lore theories. We'll get into here as well.
Yeah, definitely. And Bright Roar is definitely a big part of that whenever we get to the Valyrian Steel portion of it. But, it's kind of amazing some of the things that are just dropped in this chapter. Like we hear about Baelish going to Lysa Arryn. We hear about Jon Arryn and Robert's relationship. Obviously, Janos Slynt is here. We talk about Harrenhal. Like the amount of stuff that's touched on in this chapter is just kind of insane. And none of it feels super forced. It's almost just like little breadcrumbs for you to think about. But one of the biggest things I took away from this, rereading, of course, is, man, Tyrion should have saw this coming with Shay. He should have seen it coming, because there's a line where he kind of has a flashback that he had told Shay about Sansa Stark, but she already knew. And she said, I don't care. She's only a little girl. You'll give her a big belly and come back to me. And that's kind of what Tyrion was hoping for. He said he was hoping for indifference. And you kind of see it. It's just a quick thought in his head, like, oh, thank God that's taken care of. But in reality, this shows us exactly who Shay is. Someone who loves you most of the time, right, is not going to have that reaction, whether they're a prostitute or not. It was obvious that she was using him for status, right? And I wish, and it's just one of those times where we're in the POV of the character, so we actually fall into his blind spots and biases on our first read. But you reread this a couple times and you go, man, it's right here. That's some pretty solid evidence that maybe she's not actually in love with you, Tyrion.
Yeah. And this chapter is also, I agree with that, because this chapter is also like a big, it's a pretty big character development chapter for Tyrion as well. And remember, book Tyrion is a much darker character than show Tyrion.
There's some darkness in this chapter.
Yeah. I mean, even here, in the show, it comes across as, because we just don't get enough of it, that Tyrion's like, all right, Sansa, I'm going to leave you alone. Like, you don't want anything. But here, he's thinking about it, and he's thinking, well, she hates me, right? We have a bed, and, he's like, all their nights together in the great bed were another source of torment. He could no longer bear to sleep naked, as had been his custom. His wife was too well trained to ever say an unkind word, but the revulsion in her eyes whenever she looked on his body was more than he could bear. Tyrion had commanded Sansa to wear a sleeping shift as well. I want her, he realized. I want Winterfell, yes, but I want her as well. Child or woman or whatever she is. I want to comfort her. I want to hear her laugh. I want her to come to me willingly, to bring me her joys and her sorrows and her lust. His mouth twisted in a bitter smile. Yes, and I want to be as tall as Jaime and as strong as Sir Gregor the Mountain too, for all the bloody good it does. So, I mean, really what Tyrion is looking for is the same thing he's always looking for, which is just like somebody who actually appreciates and loves him for him, is really what it wants to. And if that person is Sansa, then great. And if it is Shay, then, that's great too. But immediately following that, unbidden, his thoughts went to Shay. Tyrion had not wanted her to hear the news from any lips but his own, so he had commanded Varys to bring her to him the night before his wedding. They met again in the eunuch's chambers, and when Shay began to undo the laces of his jerkin, he caught her by the wrist and pushed her away. Wait, he said, there's something you must hear. On the morrow, I am to wed. And then, she knows it's Sansa.
Yeah, and this is kind of where, like, the red flag is. I do want to highlight something, though. I mean, this is We love Tyrion. He's my favorite character, maybe of all time in fiction. But this is disturbing. I want her. He realized, I want Winterfell, yes, but I want her as well, child or woman or whatever she is. So, we have to remember that Tyrion is a man that is like weak to his desires, and that his self control is not his greatest asset at all. And in fact, if you need further proof of this, the fact that he decides to kill old Simon Silvertongue in this chapter is again him kind of giving in to those desires or instincts that are not the best for
Yeah.
a solid dude. And this is the beginning of the slow turn, towards villainy, a villain arc, I think, in many ways. And that's why I was talking about him and Jamie's kind of on the other path and they're crisscrossing. By the end of this book, we will know that for sure. And then Jamie's on full redemption arc and a feast for crows. Not that he doesn't do some things that are bad, obviously.
Right.
George and they're going to write a complete black and white character. But, this is a disturbing line to me from Tyrion.
If you look though, if his first thing, yes, he says, I want her child or woman or whatever she is. I view that almost as, I guess, in a way, as him just. It's weird because that paragraph, the first thing he thinks of when he's thinking of what he wants to do with her is, I want to comfort her. I want to hear her laugh. So in a way, at first, it is Tyrion trying to do the right thing. And then he sort of comes into like, well, her joys and sorrows and her lust. And eventually over time, she will not be as young as she is. And also in Game of Thrones and Westeros, people marry young women all the time. And Robert Baratheon was talking about possibly, he's talking about Marjorie Tyrell, who's like same, just around the same age as well. So, I mean, you have to certainly take that into consideration as well.
I think what makes it bad is the fact that he voices to his father that she's too young. I'll defend Tyrion a little bit here. This is his inner thoughts. He does not act on it. Right. So there is some restraint there. I kind of said, he's just giving in to all of his instincts. To be fair, he's not giving in to this exact one. But we kind of see the descent of this whenever he decides to take care of Simon Silvertongue. And then obviously in Dance of Dragons, his issues with the prostitute over the narrow sea is pretty brutal. So it's just, it's almost, he's almost degrading in some way. Like when you think about where he is in Dance with Dragons, like here you're seeing him saying, well, yeah, I do have this urge, but I'm kind of showing some restraint. I'm not going to act on it. I understand that it's bad. And then I think that he has a very different reaction to kind of that same instinct and same situation in the Dance with Dragons. So this is a good kind of signpost for us to look and be like, look where Tyrion's at now. And then we can look at this again when we finish book 5.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. We'll go a little bit ahead because we already talked a little bit about Simon Silvertongue, right? And what Tyrion's ultimately going to do about him. I will say, little bit, they talk about a dancing bear that could be at the wedding, which just, you got to think bear, maiden fair, right? A little deception that's going on there, because there will be obviously some deception going on at that wedding.
Multiple deceptions.
That could be a little thread to it, or I'm sure George was obviously very intentional in that. Yeah. So then we begin to talk to when he goes and he meets his father. So he wants to see you, the Hand, Lord Tywin. I recall who the Hand is, Pod. Tyrion said, I want my nose, not my wits. I lost my nose, not my wits. So he ends up going up there. A summons from Lord Tywin always had teeth. His father never sent for him to share a meal or a cup of wine, that was for certain. As he entered his lord father's solar a few moments later, he heard a voice saying, cherry wood for the scabbard, bound in red leather and ornamented with a row of lion's head studs in pure gold, perhaps with the garnets for the eyes. Rubies, Lord Tywin said, garnets lack the fire, which... Rubies, we know, deals with like glamoring and stuff like that, which in a way, the sword Ice is now taking on a new identity with these two Valyrian steel swords. I don't know that it's going to have any glamoring capabilities, but George does like to use those same threads, and to like everything, all the colors and stones have a theme. And in a way, you could argue that is just the theme of this, is that it is changing in a way from ice to fire, because he specifically says fire.
Love it. I love it. And if another, this is a little bit deeper down the rabbit hole. So, this is just me kind of reaching a little bit, but there's two swords here that look like twins, and the twins will be very important location a little later in this book, right? Whenever we get to Red Wedding. So
Yes.
there's a whole lot to dissect when it comes down to these swords. And then of course, after Joffrey is passed on, what as well will get passed on to Tommen. So also these
Yeah.
swords just sound so cool. Like so very cool.
Oathkeeper and yeah. What's Widow's Wail?
Yeah, Widow's Wail, yep.
Yeah. And Oathkeeper. I'm trying to think what happens to this show. Bran just keeps it, doesn't it? Bran has it.
I honestly remember nothing.
Did we just lose? Does it just get lost?
I remember so little outside of season 1 and 2 in the show. Like even season 3 and 4 to me is very blurry.
All right, let me think. Let me just think about that. Does Brienne keep it? That's an interesting question. Oathkeeper. White Walker trees across her son. Okay. What the? That's the episode. I'm at the sword. I will pull that up here and I will try to find that. But yeah, I mean that's just kind of interesting to think about because in a way, Brienne also ends up wielding it, right? She's the one who ends up wielding Oathkeeper. And if you think about a sword with rubies in it and transformation, Brienne is also undergoing like a very large transformative arc as well. So just something to keep in mind with that. I never even have it pulled up, the Game of Thrones wiki, because
ew.
Right. I know. Yeah. I never use it. So here we go. Wiki of Westeros. I don't know. I don't think anything happens to it.
We kind of forgot about Oath.
Yeah. I mean, seriously. Right.
Well, that is the problem with television shows, right? They cut things and they forget and everything else. But at least in the books, it seems that most things end up getting some sort of payoff.
Interesting. I'm sure somebody will let us know, because I guess it's just interesting. Does Jamie have it at the end, or does Brienne have it at the end? So
when we do our rewatch, we're gonna have to find out.
Yeah, that'll be a thread we'll need to keep remember. Anywho, not important to the rest of this chapter, but so let's dive back into that. So yeah, I mean, a lot of things too here is, remember, this chapter begins with Tyrion thinking, oh, I'm still in a way going to be doing a lot of these things, a lot of these big projects, stuff like that. And once we meet with Tywin Lannister, not so much.
No, we kind of figure out, he's trying to say as, the master of coin, which he doesn't want to be, but he's like, all right, master of coin, I'm going to tell you, we don't have the money for this. 7 courses will be plenty. And Tywin's like, you'll find the money, bud. Like you'll find the money. And it doubly sucks because this is a problem. Like the debt and it is highlighted a lot in the books. And then obviously the Iron Bank is going to have a huge role to play in Winds of Winter and A Dream of Spring. But Tyrion's going to be the one blamed no matter what happens, because he's the person he's going to be the fall guy no matter what. And it's very evident the disdain that Tyrion and Tywin have for each other, but Tyrion's still wanting that acceptance from his, he doesn't even, when he said, the other sword is meant for my son, no need to ask which son. Tyrion placed Jaime's sword back on the table beside Joffrey's, wondering if Robb Stark would let his brother live long enough to wield it. Yeah. Very, very interesting. He said, if Robb Stark would let his brother live long enough. That's kind of a little bit of doubt there, huh?
Yeah, there's another interesting line here too. I have highlighted here. When Tyrion puts down Joffrey's sword and took up the other, if not twins, then the two were at least cousins. This one was thicker and heavier, a half-inch wider and 3 inches longer, but they shared the same fine, clean lines and the same distinctive color, the ripples of blood and night. 3 fullers, a deeply incest, ran down the second blade from hilt to point. The king's sword had only 2. Joff's hilt was a good deal more ornate, the arms of it crossguard done as lion paws with ruby claws unsheathed, but both swords had grips of finely tooled red leather and gold lions' heads for pommels. So I do just kind of like in a way, it's, he's talking about the swords, but you're also talking about Joffrey and Jaime.
Representative, yeah.
Yeah, just like if not twins, then the two were at least cousins. So there's, in a way, kind of like some family,
Oh, definitely.
Relation there, since I guess it's his dad and his uncle.
It's his dad and his uncle, and his third cut. I don't know.
Right.
The
Yeah.
incest family tree gets a little tangled whenever you go
Yeah.
down it. Tyrion loves the blade that Jaime is getting. He calls it magnificent, said the blade has never felt more alive. And then, as he's pondering if Robb Stark would let his brother live, he actually has a line here. And as I was reading this just now, I just realized that it's George hinting to us that there's something going on. He said, "Our father must surely think so, else why have this blade forged?" Meaning that Tywin has some reason to believe that Jaime's coming home. And that's most likely because the deal has already been done with the Boltons at this point. So this is pretty major and a bit of a hint to things to come. And then to just a little bit further down, you see, if you do shit Goldfather, find a privy and get busy, which is obviously a pretty good hint towards Tywin's end at the end of this book. So just breadcrumbs everywhere for us to pick up on reread, and it makes it such a pleasure.
Yeah. Yeah. There's some other lines here too. So they talked about it, the sword, right? So you said, the steel is sufficient for 2 blades, not 3. If you have need of a dagger, take one from the armory. Robert left 100 when he died. Targaryen gave a gilded dagger with an ivory grip and a sapphire pommel for a wedding gift. And half the envoys who came to court tried to curry favor by presenting his grace with jewel encrusted knives and silver inlay swords. I just kind of like that. It's like, oh, is that still tying in perhaps the mystery of that dagger, which now is with House of the Dragon is like blown all over the place, because now it's like, well, okay, well, there's way more to that than perhaps it just being like Baelish's dagger, or was it Rhaegar's, or all that stuff. But that was for still in the books is a big deal about like because Tyrion talks about actually having a dagger, and like that he used that like a hunting dagger once. So it's just, because we still don't, there is still quite a bit of mystery to the Valyrian steel dagger.
Yeah, when I
in the
was reading
books.
this and talking about daggers, I was wondering if this is supposed to be kind of a memory jar thing. And then he talks about Robert's hunting knife that Jon Arryn gave him, which I thought was actually just really nice too, because we had Peter Baelish earlier mentioned with Liza Tully. He said, "Oh, he's going to go over to Liza Tully," and then you get Jon Arryn and Robert, and it's kind of helping you piece together the fact that maybe Peter Baelish and Liza had planned Jon Arryn's death, which again, at the end of this book, we find out. So there's another breadcrumb in this chapter. One chapter, 12 pages, like 5 breadcrumbs for things to come. It's kind of insane.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, tons. So we kind of continue on a little bit here too. And they start to talk about the Tyrells a little bit and the wedding costs. The Tyrells. Well, I'm not reading that word. Okay.
I hate it every time George uses it.
Yep. No, definitely not saying that. He says, "I will have the wedding and the waterfront. If you cannot pay for them, say so, and I shall find a master of coin who can." Yeah. So continuing on with that master of coin business. Then they talk a little bit about Varys here. I am pleased, so he's saying, so the talk has reached even him. I have, thank you. It is the piece of furniture between the window and the hearth, with the velvet canopy and the mattress stuffed with the goose down. I'm pleased you know of it. Now perhaps you might ought to try the woman. You might ought to try and know the woman who shares it with you. And he's talking about the bed. He's like, woman, child, you mean? I think Jimmy said earlier. Has the spider been whispering in your ear, or do I have my sweet sister to thank? Considering the things that went on beneath Cersei's blankets, you would think she'd have the decency to keep her nose out of this. Tell me, why is it that all of Sansa's maids are women in Cersei's service? I am sick of being spied upon in my own chambers. So, it's interesting that Tyrion clearly knows Cersei's sleeping around and all this stuff, but nobody ever brings it up with Tywin.
I think he's
is that maybe
Tywin's
still like is that maybe still like a sibling thing? I was like, yeah, there's just things we don't tell Dad.
I think so. It maybe shows a little bit of that restraint I talked about earlier from Tyrion's side, but also I think bringing news to Tyrion or to Tywin that he does not want to hear is going to hurt you as well, right?
Yeah.
And also you do have to wonder if there's not a little bit of fear from Cersei. Like he fears Cersei in a little bit because she did try to have him murdered, right? So I think that maybe he's worried about pushing her hand. It's a very delicate situation. Tywin's aware, though. Tywin knows. Yeah, he definitely knows.
He just refuses to accept it. Now, there is another thing here. Okay, you
I
know
knew
where
you
I'm
were gonna bring
going.
it up. I
You
knew it.
know where I'm going.
I know
Okay.
exactly where you're going.
Perhaps I should have married Sansa Stark to Moonboy. He might have known what to do with her. Okay. Now, here we have Tyrion understanding Moonboy knows what to do. And then
Moonboy is laying
later,
pipe.
Moonboy might be laying pipe because Tyrion brings it up to Jamie, and Jamie thinks about it like he thinks about it in like 7 chapters straight. He's like, maybe Tyrion wasn't lying. Maybe Moonboy was. Maybe Cersei banged Moonboy.
Moonboy is the best gag in A Song of Ice and Fire. It is the funniest through line of the series. I love it so much. This poor court jester dude is just being used in the most disgusting ways for jokes. I mean, yeah, he also might be physically being used. Yeah, for sure. Would have Moonboy have made a better husband to Sansa Stark? We may never know. Maybe Moonboy ends up being the Lord of Winterfell. Maybe this is a breadcrumb.
Maybe Moonboy is the Night King. Okay. I mean, Azor, maybe he's Azor Ahai. All right. I'm just saying, anytime Moonboy comes up, you need to pay attention. So
at the end of it all, it's Moonboy versus Patches. Could you imagine?
Could be.
I love
There's
it.
the other one too, Butterbumps. He comes up too. Okay, so we'll continue on a little bit here too, and get talking about the end of it. So this is where they talk about Jaina Slint, right? And he is sent to the wall, and the Black Brothers choose their own commander. He reminded them, Lord Slint is new to the wall. I know I sent him there, but why should they pick him over a dozen other senior men? Because his father suggested in a tone that Tyrion was quite, the simpleton. If they do not vote as they are told, the wall will melt before it sees another man. Yes, that would work. Tyrion hitched forward. Jaina Slint is the wrong man, father. We'd do better with the commander of the Shadow. We'd do better with the commander of the Shadow Tower or Eastwatch by the Sea. The commander of Shadow Tower is a Mallister of Seaguard. Eastwatch is held by an Iron Man. Neither would serve his purposes. Lord Tywin's tone said clear enough. Jaina Slint is a butcher's son. Tywin reminded his father forcefully. You yourself told me. I recall what I told you. Castle Black is not Harrenhal. However, the Night's Watch is not the King's Council. There is a tool for every task and a task for every tool. So, I mean, it's just interesting, really, that Tywin is so concerned about what's going on at the Night's Watch.
Well, I think he knows that he's about to have a pretty big change up in the north with Roose Bolton. I think he knows at this point. So I think that he's probably wanting, as the amount of stability that he can add, like any amount of stability he can add will help him in the long run to try to keep Roose Bolton in charge up there. So I think he's thinking that way. But like,
I think there's something else.
What do you think?
In this chapter,
okay,
we heard about the conversation that Tywin had with Olenna. Now we see that conversation in Game of Thrones.
Okay.
And there is still, however, a book theory and even in some ways a show theory that Tywin was also in on it, on getting rid of Joffrey in favor of Tommen.
Oh.
So he told Tyrion not to bring Shay. He's also perhaps setting Jamie up to be. He's got these Valyrian steel swords made. He's still, he wants, again, show conversation we don't see we see a conversation in the show we don't see in the books. He still wants Jamie to be his heir of Casterly Rock.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, that could have still been something. I mean, there's still some of it. But maybe he knew that somebody's got to be the fall guy, and that fall guy might be Tyrion.
Yeah, maybe.
So that's why he's a little more concerned about what's going on at the Night's Watch, because he knows.
And he does tell Tyrion, "I was going to send you to the wall." Right? He says, "I was going to send you to the wall. We weren't going to execute you. You're out of your mind." Yeah, maybe, but also like, I don't know if Tyrion's any safer at the wall if Jaina Slint's in charge. You know what I mean? Like, I think in fact Tyrion might be way worse off.
Well, it's just because I know that there might be some unrest in the north, but the north is never going to, like, the wall should not ride down and deal with the Boltons if the Starks get taken out.
No, they shouldn't. But
he's just planning ahead.
Maybe. I mean, Jon Snow is up there, and he knows that Jon Snow's there, right? So that's something to consider. Hey. maybe that's it. Maybe he just wants Janice there to decapitate the only Stark left that could claim Winterfell. I mean, that it could be as simple as that. But I just love the line about being like, oh, but he can be easily bought. And Tywin's like, yeah, and who's gonna outbid us? Like, dang,
Yeah.
man. Like Tywin is one of these characters in a book that's written as a crafty person who's actually crafty. Like, we're not just told that he's wise or clever. He actually is. And it's interesting to have Gurm write this dialogue between two characters that I consider to be extremely smart. But Tywin has more experience, and George writes it in a way that I believe that. And it's just really good. This dialogue is fantastic between them, by the way. Like the whole thing with Sansa, and then and it just seamlessly flows into Janice slant at the wall. Like the dialogue is just excellent, which is why they lifted so much of it verbatim for the show, because you couldn't really improve much on it, I don't think.
Yeah. Okay. I'm looking at the Song of Ice and Fire reread subreddit, which I always like because I just like to see what other people are saying about it. Especially they go really deep into it over there, and they've reread this series like 4 or 5 times, and sometimes it's not influenced by like current events, like House of the Dragon. Be like, all right, well now we got to think about the dagger differently. So, pull up here. So the song, right? For hands of gold are always cold, but a woman's hands are warm. And this is from somebody on Reddit saying, as we know, because we're rereaders, in universe reality will once mimic the lyrics of a song. And this is pulling from another line. Tyrion slit his hand under his father's chin and twisted. The links tightened, digging into her neck. For hands of gold are always cold, but a woman's hands are warm, he said. He gave the cold hands another twist as the warm ones beat away his tears. And that's when he is killing Shay.
Dang.
Yeah, so you tie that back to this chapter as well.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
and I've read this, this is technically, if this way through, would be like my 7th or 8th reread, and I'm still finding out new things. It's crazy.
Yeah. I know that's the whole deal. Because sometimes we're looking for deeper theories when sometimes it's the smaller connections that are just right in front of us.
Yeah.
The problem is that there are so many deeper connections that we're always like tunnel vision down the rabbit's hole as much as possible. Sometimes it's just small little stuff like this, just a tiny little connection.
Yeah, and that's the thing, man. It's like some people are like, "Oh, you guys are reaching, or you're looking too far." And it's like, nah, not really. Not when you
don't have to,
man. I'm not saying that some theories aren't completely crazy, but I'm just saying that like the intention, there's so much intention behind the sentences that George writes. It's staggering.